leather jacket there. He'll be playing Infect. Now, if you weren't here in round one, tell me a bit about this land still deck from Phan.
So this is a throwback to a much older time in Legacy when this deck used to be very common. The deck plays Standstill as its primary card drawing engine, alongside lands like Mishra's Factory and Fairy's Conclave. So it can play Standstill on an empty board, and then it has your usual assortment of removal spells in red and counter spells in blue.
Now, game starts out Tom Ross on a Noble Hierarch. The removal spells in red, you expect 4 lightning bolts, but here's a cincher. The second removal spell Phan has chosen will probably be very good in this matchup.
Sudden Shock is a card I've been talking about for a couple weeks now as I think being a reasonable choice for Legacy. It's going to be particularly good in this matchup because Tom's trying to get into a point where he can play pump spells over the top of someone's bolts, and Sudden Shock dead ends all of that right away. So if Tom's not aware that Sudden Shock is in Lamb's deck, and unless he's been scouting, he probably doesn't have that information and won't be playing around it. The way that Tom normally plays Infect could be disastrous for him here.
All right, so a little bit of jockeying on the first few turns. Tom starts on Noble Hierarch and Inkmoth Nexus. Lam just makes a pair of lands here, and then you get right to the action. Tom swings with Inkmoth Nexus, goes for an Invigorate, and Sudden Shock straight from Lam will cancel all of those plans. You saw Vines of Vastwood and Force of Will in Tom's hand.
Exactly. Tom was making that play, assuming he had the kill. He had Vines of Vastwood, Force of Will, blue card, but Sudden Shock ended it all, and now Tom may not be able to rebuild.
Yeah, he doesn't even have another Infector. Drew Crop Rotation for the turn so he can get another Inkmoth if he needs it, but you see that power there. Remember, Split Second is uncounterable because you can't play anything in response to it, and also you can't pump in response. You just can't do anything.
And you saw Tom make a little expression like, okay, I guess that's a card in my opponent's deck. This is pretty bad.
Yeah, Tom did, as you said, he had a turn 3 kill there that he went for. And
with double protection, Vines plus Force of Will. I mean, if he was expecting to play against a Daze and a Lightning Bolt, that's a lot of resistance on Lamb's side, and he had that covered. But Sudden Shock, Tom was not ready for it, couldn't play around, obviously, and now Tom in a lot of trouble.
Well, Tom's going to have to rebuild here. He goes for a Crop Rotation, presumably to get a new Inkmoth Nexus, and that will get a response from Lam. See 2 Volcanic Islands to accompany this Mishra's Factory, and it's just going to be Counterspell here to take care of that Crop Rotation.
Actual, factual Counterspell.
If you didn't see earlier, you know some of the art there on Lam's cards. All the backgrounds are actually blacked out on all the arts, and then most of the borders are whited out. So cards may look a little different than you're used to here.
Yeah, I believe that's an Arena Counterspell from way back in the day that has been altered.
There you have it. Not one of the arts you see very often here for Counterspell.
I mean, I believe this promo is approaching 20 years old. Yeah. And we don't see a lot of Counterspells on camera to begin with.
Well, after the Counterspell, Tom's going to rebuild, casts a Treasure Cruise. Treasure Cruise, in addition to the Infect deck. Tom just runs 1 copy of it, though. Hasn't jumped on the 4X Cruise boat just yet.
Well, this deck is all about trying to get fast kills. It's not that great at filling up its graveyard. The first Delve card is close to free, but after that, you start approaching diminishing returns very quickly.
Well, he'll see what he's playing against. Jetaxing Probe comes from Tom, and he sees Standstill, Lightning Bolt, Jace the Mind Sculptor, and a second copy of Mishra's Factory. Now he knows that, okay, he knows what he's playing against now, but the question is, has Tom ever played this matchup before?
Well, I'm sure he's used to playing against blue-red decks with counter spells and removal spells, but Sudden Shock throws a wrench into everything.
Absolutely. A swing from Noble Hierarch will make a slight dent into Lam's life total. But not much here. A second man land, now a fetch land drawn from Phan. He wants to set up either Standstill or Jace here. And he's just going to start killing things. Starts with Lightning Bolt on Noble Hierarch.
I think he wants to keep the board clean so he can go ahead and deploy Standstill.
Yeah, Tom's going to Vines it. You may still see Lam go for a Standstill because the Mishra's Factories can actually keep Noble Hierarch at bay.
Exactly.
There you have it, Standstill. Namesake card of the deck, Landstill for the interaction between these man lands and Standstill. This was Treasure Cruise before Treasure Cruise was cool.
A little more work required.
Yeah, you still get your 3 cards. The idea behind the deck is that your opponent is always going to be the one who has to break this Standstill.
And you can play it on neutral boards because you have Fairy Conclaves and Mishra's Factories.
And now Lam starts on the attack. Mishra's Factory swings. Some danger to Phan's strategy is showing up right here. Tom has his own manlands. He plays a Inkmoth Nexus. His manlands actually kill faster than Phan's.
Exactly. You're looking at an activation here. He can use Pendelhaven, and then he gets an Exalted trigger. That's a 4-turn clock.
So will Lam have to break his own standstill? Early indications would point to yes. Certainly not something he would be excited about doing.
That Nexus was the biggest draw on Tom's deck.
Yeah, I mean, Lam's deck's predicated on the fact that manlands are very good with standstill, so it would stand to reason that Tom's manlands are equally good.
Yeah.
And here comes one factory to swing in. He's going to go ahead and pump it with his second factory.
And Tom can work the game into a position where when he's breaking the standstill, it's because he's in the middle of a lethal attack, which puts a lot more pressure on Lam to find the right thing.
And here you go. That's an attack for 3 poison from Inkmoth Nexus. That's actually 3 poison on Lam Phan's life total. It's not on the Inkmoth. And you talked about a huge draw of Inkmoth Nexus. How about this for a huge draw back? Over there you see Lam Phan with Wasteland for the turn.
The perfect draw. And now Tom is back in the position of having to break the standstill most likely.
Wasteland going right for the Inkmoth. And the beatings here now will continue. Another Ink Mistress Factory fired up. And swing. Remember that the factories can go ahead and pump each other, which is what Phan has been doing. It's 1 fewer damage than if they both attacked, but it does let him have more untapped mana in case of an emergency.
Yeah. And he's pretty happy with the pace of this game, too, because Tom is going to have to break sooner rather than later. So no reason to rush.
Yep. Landstill very rarely breaks their own standstills. 3 more damage will put Tom down to 5.
He also doesn't want to attack with 2 2/2s because Tom can block with a Noble Hierarch and use, or rather, there's at least some risk of a pump spell happening. So this is a much safer route of play.
Now Tom has drawn some cards that are actually pretty helpful here. If he can get an Infector going, his last 2 draws have been the copy of Berserk and then the 1-of copy of Become Immense, the uncommon from Khans of Tarkir. Together, that pumps a creature's power by 12.
He is running out of time, though, is the issue here.
Absolutely. At 5, it's a 2-turn clock from these factories. You see Lam putting him down to 2. Tom's going to be forced to make a move.
And in fact, he doesn't really have anything in his hand to break a standstill with.
Yeah, I mean, he would have to block and pump defensively here. Right? He would block and Become Immense his creature. He does have 6 mana. He could just pay for it.
Well, Lam can just go untap, attack with both factories.
Yeah,
and he has to break the standstill because it's a lethal attack.
You see it there, Tom never breaking the standstill. Scoops the game, and game 1 is in Lam Phan's direction.
Oh, sudden shock. It is really good to see this card on camera. I thought it was poised to have its presence known in Legacy, and in that game it was the best card in the format for Lam to have in that spot.
I mean, it just won him the game. Tom went for a turn 3 kill, and he never really came back from it.
Yep.
Let's go ahead and take a look, though, at sideboards here. So we'll start with Tom Ross. There's nothing you can do to board anything against Sudden Shock, but what can he do against the rest of the deck?
Well, he's got 2 copies of Crow's Grip, a Spellskite, a Sylvan Library, a Submerge, a Nature's Claim, a Force of Will, a Spell Pierce, 2 copies of Hydroblast, a Blue Elemental Blast, a Numaza's Jitte, a Necropede, a Bajuka Bog, and a Wasteland. I think he can bring in the Wasteland here to help him a little bit more in the standstill battles. I like bringing in the Blue Blast and the 2 copies of Hydroblast. Maybe Nature's Claim is a reasonable response to Mistress Factory. Maybe there's other enchantments and artifacts in the deck. The Spellskite seems good against a deck with Lightning Bolt.
Yeah, it's interesting because the card he's most scared of is Sudden Shock, but there just actually isn't a card to play around that.
No, he just has to accept that it's going to be bad for him. Try his best not to play into it too much. I think the line of play that you saw last game where he went for a kill with Force of Will plus Vines backup. I don't think you're going to see that out of him in game 2. I think in that spot he's just going to attack and pass. If Lion wants to play the Lightning Bolts, all right, he'll play back. But if it's Sudden Shock, he needs to protect himself a little bit.
Yeah, ideally he'd want to have I think Pendelhaven would be his best card in playing around Sudden Shock. You can Pendelhaven 1/1 before pumping it.
Exactly. He goes from 1/1 to 2/3. If he responds with Sudden Shock, all right, great.
You didn't lose a card.
Exactly. And if he doesn't, well, now you have a 2/3 and you can start pumping. Sudden Shock doesn't matter as much. On Lam's side, 2 copies of Engineer Explosive, 4 copies of Relic of Patronus, 2 Surgical Extraction, a Flush of Storm, a Elemental Blast, 2 Pyroblast, 3 Pyroclasm. I like bringing in the Red Blast, the Pyroclasms, and the Engineer Explosives. Just more cheap sweepers.
Yeah, the cheap removal is already on Lam's side. Now, there's a couple ways to fight. In fact, you can fight it with removal or you can fight it with counter spells. You see cards in Lam's deck like Spell Pierce, Spell Snare, Counter Spell. Does he gets rid of these for removal spells?
I think that both modes of interaction are fine. And in an ideal world, you have a mixture of both because it makes it hard for Tom to play against. What matters the most is mana efficiency. The Infect deck, because it's flush with 0 and 1 mana spells to push through the combo, if you're stuck with a bunch of counter spells and 3 mana removal spells in your hand, that's not going to cut it. Tom actually likes playing against Abrupt Decay decks because he feels like Abrupt Decay is just too slow to matter. So I don't really care what your form of interaction is, just make sure it's cheap.
Yeah, that's a really well put. Infect does have the advantage that can just, and oftentimes in these counterspell fights, thanks to things like Daze and Invigorate, it can just play more spells than its opponent.
It's a very common play pattern for Tom. Most people look at Infect and they say, I just have to go for it right away. And that's not the way that Tom approaches the deck. Tom gets in a shot here, gets in a shot there, tries to make it so it's not efficient for you to play your defensive cards, and then in one turn, when he's ready to pick a fight with a bunch of 0 and 1 mana spells of his own, that's where he's going to go for the kill. And if your hand's bottlenecked with too much expensive interaction, Tom's going to plow through that in one shot.
Makes a lot of sense. Now, I want to talk a little bit about land still. This is a deck we have not seen on the Open Series for well over a year. Phan 9-0 day 1 with this. We saw him lose his round 10 matchup to Mud in what seemed just like a really poor matchup for the deck. Then came back with 2 more wins. You know, where's this deck been the whole time?
Well, Lamb is absolutely trying to bully Delver decks with this list. And that makes a lot of sense because Blue-Red Delver is the most played deck in the tournament, most likely, or at least the best performing deck. And there's other Stripes of Delver in the room as well. Sudden Shock, Lightning Bolt, Snapcaster Mage, a lot of cheap interaction. Man lands in a format where people are cutting wastelands. This is bullying up on the small creature decks. Against a deck like Mud, these low impact removal spells like Lightning Bolt and Sudden Shock, they don't matter very much because they're putting Worm Coil engines into play. So those kind of defenses don't really help. But against a deck that's packing a bunch of 1 and 2 and 3 toughest creatures, Lam is very well suited to win that kind of fight.
So in a room full of Delver, we can say this is one approach to actually beating the Blue-Red Delver deck.
Absolutely. I think I had to imagine his matchup is good against all Stripes of Delver decks.
All right, well, we're underway with game 2. Tom chose the play. Gets to have good knowledge here. Starts on Jataxian Probe. We'll lay it out. We see from Phan 4 lands. He has 2 manlands, both Fairy Conclave and Mishra's Factory. A Standstill, a Brainstorm, and an Engineered Explosives.
This is a very land-still hand. Some man lands, a Standstill, a Cantrip, and a Sweeper.
Yeah, it really goes hand in hand with what the deck's trying to do. And with that knowledge, Tom's going to go ahead and start his attack here. Won't get blown out necessarily by the Engineered Explosives. He's going to start on Noble Hierarch. Looks like he has 2 Vines of Vastwood, a Force of Will. The Infector in his hand is a Blighted Agent.
Though Tom's deck does not play that well against ways to remove permanents that are on the board. He's got a lot of counters. He's got ways to make things hexproof. But beating an Engineered Explosives that's sitting on the table is a little bit more complicated. Not to say he can't do it, but it's not the type of card he really wants to be playing against.
Yeah, Inkmoth Nexus can help a lot there. Does that card can't get blown up by Engineered Explosives. But yeah, I would say you're right that it's not ideal. You see, Tom kept a 1 land hand. His next draw is Sylvan Library. He doesn't get his 2nd land just yet. He can make Sylvan Library, though. That should be helpful. Last card in his hand is Treasure Cruise.
And not running out the Blighted Angel just yet. He anticipates this is going to be a longer game, and the card advantage and selection that Sylvan Library can give him is better to get established sooner rather than later.
I'm interested to see how much Phan wants to, if he has the ability, would want to fight over this card. He could try to Brainstorm to find a Force of Will for it. This card is going to be pretty good against his strategy, but he decides that he can go through it instead.
I mean, Standstill is not a horrible response. Takes the wind out of the sails
on this board.
Takes the wind out of the sails of Tom drawing a lot of cards here. And
Sure.
we know that Lem, because of the factory and the Conclave, is well suited to win a Standstill game. Tom will again have to break first.
Now, if he plays a standstill, is there a chance that Tom just immediately cracks it to try to flood Lam's hand with cards?
It's a good strategy.
Lam will play a land and just pass. Tom now gets to library. He's at 5 cards. He can deal a fair amount of damage to himself here.
Though I do not believe that there's a land hanging out in those cards.
Yeah, so he's going to go ahead and take them all, taking 8, going down to 9. Needs to find a land. He'll go for Blighted Agent. He drew a Pyroblast as well as a Nature's Claim. Or a Hydroblast, rather. There is a Pyroclasm in Phan's hand. Imagine he'll pull the trigger on that one.
For sure.
Opponent's stuck on lands. He'd love to get his creature and one of his mana sources.
And Tom really can't dig that much further with the Sylvan library because there's bolts and sudden shocks hanging out.
Yeah, there
Lam's deck.
Lam can deal damage, not very well, but it is possible. Tom can't go down to. He can maybe go to 5. He certainly. And that's even risky. He certainly can't go to 1.
Going to 5 means you can never fight against sudden shock. We know this. I suppose Tom can try to Nature's Claim his own Sylvan library as an emergency response, but it does make the bolts matter if he falls to 5.
I'm a little interested to see him board in Nature's Claim. I'm not entirely sure what the target is for that guy.
Well, there's Mishra's Factory. And
right, that's an artifact creature. Okay.
And he could just be anticipating there's other stuff as well.
Sure. Mishra's Factory is the land for the turn from Phan.
That seems like a pretty juicy spot to pull a trigger on Pyroclasm.
I see a lot of options here. He's going to go ahead and go for Pyroclasm. And there is a Force of Will in Tom's hand. He can pitch either Hydroblast or Treasure Cruise to it. I think, it almost seems foregone that he's going to fight over this.
I don't think he can let this resolve. He's got to try to do something.
He's going to pitch Hydroblast. Decides to hang on to Treasure Cruise. Tom's really digging in for a long game here.
Well, he might need to gas back up, and the Sylvan Library is at risk of getting shut off.
Yeah, Spell Pierce is waiting in Phan's hand. It's a lot of patience on his part. He's debating whether or not he wants to Pierce here. You have to, I think he would, but...
Oh, it's just a question of which reactive card does he want to use. Keep in mind, he's got a lot of different soft counters, and there's a lot of different cards in Tom's deck he's playing around, so which counterspell he uses is really important.
He's going to go opt for Flusterstorm here. Probably there's advantages, I suppose, to both. Flusterstorm's a little bit narrower of a counterspell, but better in a counter war. Either way, this is going to win the counter war. He's going to sweep up Tom's board.
Well, Tom still is sitting on an Invigorate here, so he has the option of saving one of his creatures, or at least trying to. But he needs both of them. He's short on mana, and he needs an Infector.
So he opts for the mana instead of the Infect creature. He will Invigorate Noble Hierarch.
And this is all to try to get him to a spot where he can cast Treasure Cruise and try to reload.
Phan now tapped out. May just have to let this one happen.
I wouldn't be surprised if he forced back if he can.
We'll see whether or not he has a Force of Will. And it looks like he does. Go ahead with Force of Will there. He wants Tom's entire board and is willing to give up a lot for it.
Well, what are you going to Force of Will if not this?
Great point. Force of Will pitches Standstill. That sweeps up the board. Tom's left with just a Tropical Island and a Sylvan Library. Phan with 3 cards, 3 lands in play, 3 cards in hand as well. And Tom finds a lot of lands on top of his deck. He does have the ability to reload. Among the lands he found was an Inkmoth Nexus.
This does set him up for a nice turn of taking a Nexus, playing it, and using 2 mana plus 6 cards in the graveyard to cast Treasure Cruise, and trying to reload.
He's going to go over the first half of that. He'll play Nexus, but not go for Treasure Cruise right away. And here comes an attack. Mishra's Factory is going to get Nature's Claimed. Phan is going to Spell Pierce the Nature's Claim. And that'll be fine. Tom takes 2 and actually drops to 6.
I suppose that was the reason not to Treasure Cruise last turn is Tom's afraid of taking 2 points of damage. It's a huge cost right now.
Yeah, it's a lot of his life. And now it'll be Treasure Cruise. The one of Cruise being cast once again. 7 cards in Tom's graveyard are exiled, and here comes 3 more if this resolves. And indeed it does. He finds a second Ink Moth along with a Noble Hierarch.
And Tom's got to get a move on here and probably play a little bit riskier than he otherwise would like to, because again, he's at 6.
Yeah, he has to watch out for burn spells in addition to that factory that's attacking him. He plays a second Ink Moth, passes his turn back. And now Mishra's Factory goes back to work. 2 swings in. Tom's going to go ahead and looks like defensively try to kill it. He's going to block with Ink Moth and attempt an Invigorate. Engineered Explosives and Pyroblast among the cards in Phan's hand.
Unfortunate for Lane that he was not able to get the Pyroblast to line up against Treasure Cruise the right way.
And that will take down the factory. And it's actually starting to look like Tom may be grabbing control of this game. Phan paid a pretty big price over that Pyroclasm. And now we have a board where Tom is left with 2 Ink Moths and Phan has an Engineered Explosives. That doesn't line up well for him. He plays Explosives on 1.
Still, one of the best ways to fight through a deck that's trying to overload on removal is, you know, draw on 3 cards.
Yeah, Treasure Cruise was great here. The Treasure Cruise and Sylvan Library combo, you could say. And it kind of shows me the standstills in Phan's deck are a bit of a risk. You saw him end up pitching 1 to Forcible there. Just I think because of how good Inkmoth Nexus can be.
Yeah.
You know, it's not always, it's never going to be completely safe for him to make a standstill. Tom could always just start dropping Ink Moths.
And a lot of decks, when they are in a position where they had to break standstill, it's one of those things where they just had to get something going and they're breaking it. When Tom's breaking it, it might just be for lethal.
Swing with Inkmoth Nexus, and he's going to go for Vines of Vastwood. Will it deal 5? Looks like it will.
And this is some of the gutsier lines of play I was talking about before. I think this is what Tom needs to do given his life total.
That puts Phan to 5 poison counters. Another Vines of Vastwood lurks in Tom's hand, so he has the ability to go for lethal next turn.
And this is just straight up a Treasure Cruise game. Lamb had control of this. He had killed Tom's stuff. He had very few resources to work with, and the amount that he was able to reload because of Treasure Cruise is taking this game away from Lamb.
Second Engineered Explosives from Phan. That one's going to be on 2. He has a land. Going to crack it. His last card, as we know, is Pyroblast. So he is, if Tom goes for the Vines for the kill, Phan's got it. And Tom's got it.
I think Lamb's going to try to make a good face of it here.
Going to blow up the Sylvan Library, and now Tom knows he has it.
Yep.
Swing, attack, and Vines. Then we'll be on to game 3.
I thought that Lamb was possibly doing that to represent sudden shock there.
Exactly.
Get the land preemptively, but doing it just to get the Sylvan Library off the table, and that's the opening Tom needs to go to game 3.
Right. So as we move on to game 3, then you look back, you know, how much work did Sylvan Library do there? Lamb felt like he did not want to force it. He let it go through. It certainly drew Tom 2 cards. Wasn't, though, I think you're right, it was a Treasure Cruise game at the end of the day.
Lamb did a great job of trading off resources. Had Tom completely pressed on mana, on cards in hand. Sylvan Library did a lot of work for Tom in that game, but Treasure Cruise is what blew it open.
It's interesting. So Phan has more card draw on his own. You know, he has a copy of Dig Through Time, a copy of Treasure Cruise, and, well, really more importantly, the copies of Standstill in his deck, the 3 copies of Standstill. But it's not as robust as Tom's in that, you know, Standstill, things have to go his way, really, for that to work.
Well,
it's never safe.
Correct. His deck is very well suited to play Standstill on an empty board. You can do it just on the back of his 6-man lands. Most decks in the format don't have that sort of thing going on, and so Standstill can just be dropped into play, and you can wait for a man land. Even if you're just draw and say go. You don't have to do anything. Also, Lamb's deck is playing 24 lands. Most decks in Legacy play far fewer than that. So even if you're just playing draw go, waiting for your man lands, your opponent's probably going to be discarding to hand size. Because they don't have as many lands as you, they're going to be discarding until they break it. In this matchup, it's a lot riskier for Lamb because Tom, if he has a Nexus, maybe the better equipped deck to race. In fact, most certainly is. and Lamb may be forced to break his own standstill.
Yeah, in a lot of matchups, as you mentioned, the land still player on the play can just drop a turn 2 standstill regardless of whether he has a man land in his hand. Because eventually he'll have one and he has the inevitability. Here he needs to first, really seems like he has to secure the board before he can do that.
Yeah. Or at least he's aware that it's a risk he's incurring.
Right. Now, to be fair, Tom only plays the one copy of Sylvan Library and the one Treasure Cruise. Phan does have a Treasure Cruise of his own, along with the Dig Through Time and the 3 standstills. So if we get into a card-drawing war again, Phan still is the favorite.
I think that Lamb may want to consider boarding out the standstills, though, or at least some of them, for the reasons that you mentioned.
They certainly could be stronger. He has boarded in 2 engineered explosives, and it looks like the Pyroblasts, Red Blast, and Pyroclasm.
It's a lot of slots.
A lot of slots. The Red Blast in his hand that game didn't seem great. He was left without a target.
I still think it's worth having, even though a lot of the cards in Tom's deck are green. Just cheap interaction matters so much. Even if it doesn't always line up the right way. I think that Lamb still has to give himself the best shot possible to interact with Tom.
So in the choice between having a Pyroblast or just the card counter spell, you feel like he needs to be on the Pyroblast side of things.
I think he wants a mixture of both of those. I don't think he can really cut counter spell either, but if I had to choose between one or the other, I would probably take Pyroblast.
Does make sense. So we are on to game 3 here. This is Lamb Phan versus Tom Ross. They're 11-1 here in Grand Prix, New Jersey. Round 13, so this and 2 more rounds remain. Remember, any player finishing with 13 wins will win an invite to the Pro Tour, as well as possibly win a berth in the top 8.
Such a big deal for Tom, who has had such an impressive run on the Open Series, built so many influential decks in Standard, has begun writing again, contributing great content, and the one thing that's eluded him thus far is getting back onto the Pro Tour, which is a goal of his. Came just a little bit short in Orlando, was
right.
X-0-1 with 2 rounds to go.
The last undefeated player.
Losing back-to-back rounds to miss the top 8, not qualify for the Pro Tour. But this format's his wheelhouse. He's played a lot of Legacy, specifically with this deck, has had great results, and needs a 2-1 finish over the next 3 rounds to get back onto the Pro Tour.
Yeah, the winner of this should be in a pretty good spot. They would just need to win one of their remaining rounds, whereas the loser of this match would have to win out.
Yep. A lot of stress every round. I played in Grand Prix of this size, made a deep run in a big Grand Prix like this, and even when your record's awesome, you always feel like you're a loss away from everything slipping away. I'm sure, I'll tell you right now, that's what Brian Bronduin, 12-0 right now, that's what he's thinking about.
Yeah, he does. In his situation, Brian Bronduin more or less has 3 PTQ finals coming up.
Yeah.
Just needs to get one of them.
It felt like every win that I got added more stress to the tournament, not less.
Does that change once they're in the top 8, or does it just keep compounding?
Yeah, once I knew I was locked, sigh of relief. Until that point, every round was stress.
Lamb went to 6. Doesn't look too happy with the 6-card hand, but he's kept it as we're underway with game 3. Lamb starts on Trop on Volcanic Island. Tom is going to start with a Jataxian Probe. He has a Wasteland in hand.
That's a great probe here from Tom.
Yeah.
If Lamb's hand is land light, he's going to attack that Volcanic, and if it's land heavy like you see here, he's going to develop his board.
Lamb's hand, 2 more fetch lands, a Wasteland, and a Mishra's Factory. The only spell in it's Lightning Bolt. Not a bad spell to have here. Between the Wasteland and the Lightning Bolt, Lamb has decent chances here.
It's not terrible, but Tom's deck is very good at overwhelming one piece of defense. We've seen that over and over again.
Yeah, Lamb's down 2 cards here, so he's got work to do. His answers are still just 1-for-1s.
Yeah, you saw the surprise value game 1 of Sudden Shock. That's how he got his 2 cards.
Yeah, it just won him the game, really.
But now, that's going to be on Tom's radar. And I don't think the same thing is going to happen here in the post-board games.
Yeah, Lamb hasn't drawn a Sudden Shock yet, and even then, Tom will very likely not let Lamb get 2 cards from it. See a lot of weapons in Tom's hand. Wasteland of his own. Spell Pierce, Become Immense. Glyph, Blighted Agent. A lot of good answers here. And Brainstorm to tie it all together. Second turn, Lamb's going to go ahead and make a factory. will we get to see a creature from Tom, or maybe will he try to protect it from Spell Pierce? From Lightning Bolt.
He's working with perfect information. He's just drawing another Gitaxian Probe, so if he wants to see what the draw step is, he can check that out too. But if he's on the 1 Infector, I don't think he's just going to let that just run that into a Lightning Bolt and have it get killed.
Yep, Noble Hierarch is going to be the play. Looks like he's waiting, as you said, to be able to protect the Blighted Agent. In the meantime, Phan has drawn another copy of Factory. Looks like he did get a blue card this turn. He is setting up good shop with his lands here. He has the man lands that he'd want. He's still light on answers right now, it looks.
And that's a big concern when he's playing against Blighted Agent, potentially, because these man lands don't offer him any protection.
And Tom with a huge draw there. It was Invigorate for the turn. That spell as a free spell is just an insurance policy against the 1 Lightning Bolt in Phan's hand. And now Tom will take a look at what the 2 new cards are. See, Spell Pierce and Factory have been added.
Taking a moment to get this recorded.
Yeah, in these games, it seemed like some of the difficulties that Phan has been having is that he doesn't have that much card draw in his deck. He's this control deck that's actually light on card draw.
He has a lot of 1-for-1 answers.
Yep.
But he's light on card advantage, and he's light on ways to win the game quickly. And that's a recipe to give Tom a lot of draw steps, even after Lamb has blunted the initial offensive. And that's kind of what we saw in game 2. There was a big Pyroclasm fight. Tom was left with nothing, but it wasn't like Lamb was applying any pressure. Tom was able to Sylvan Library for, 3 extra cards.
Right.
Which set up a Treasure Cruise, which gave Tom the extra resources to push through Lamb's 1-for-1s.
I think that's exactly it. It's not clear to me that the Landstill deck can just wait forever and, play that long game against Infect.
Yeah.
Relic of Progenitus to play from Phan. That can't be something that Tom is too concerned about.
I think that Sudden Shock is the swing card of the matchup. Lamb has a lot of flexibility to play the game in all sorts of different ways when he has that card. When he doesn't, he's just playing with his bolts and counterspells. Tom's beaten bolts and counterspells before.
Yeah, Sudden Shock is almost certain to net Phan a 2-for-1 when he casts it. So what Tom's trying to do is he's trying to set up a situation where he can take a couple 2-for-1s. You see a really strong Brainstorm here from him. Now multiple copies of Invigorate. A Crop Rotation, Become Immense. Tom, huge amount of pump spells. And finally makes his creature. This one's Blighted Agent.
And if Tom's putting the Blighted Agent into play from Lamb's side of the table, that means Tom's saying, I'm ready to go. I know what you have. I'm ready to pick a battle right now.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether or not Phan cracks the Relic of Progenitus. It actually turns off the Become Immense that's in Tom's hand if Phan does. But he hasn't seen Become Immense just yet, so probably wouldn't be playing around it.
Well, he has seen Treasure Cruise.
He has seen Treasure Cruise.
So a big Delve card's on his radar.
It's interesting. It's a big Delve card, but not usually a Delve card that you'd expect to see in a counter war, in a big spell fight.
Right.
That said, Phan's going to crack his Relic, draws a copy of Counter Spell. And another land for the turn. So could start to try to go for bolts on that Blighted Agent. If he does, he wants to do it during his own turn. Force of Will was the draw for the turn there.
I think he's got to pick a fight now because it's only going to get worse.
Yep, Lightning Bolt will try for Blighted Agent. Tom quickly invigorates it. Tom has the mana to pay for Spell Pierce here. So the Blighted Agent becomes a 5/5 temporarily. It will survive the Lightning Bolt.
And I think that Tom's going to want to avoid a big stack getting built up here because of Flusterstorm. Although now Lamb is shields down on blue mana, so it's less of a concern.
Yep, Counter Spell is going to try to hit the Invigorate. Worst case scenario is that he gets a second Invigorate out of Tom's hand. You see Spell Pierce, Invigorate, Crop Rotation, and second Crop Rotation, and Become Immense in Tom's hand.
Yep.
And he will let the Invigorate get countered and just go for another Invigorate. Phan's fighting this one to the end. It's going to be Force of Will, pitching his remaining blue card. And he should be able to win the fight here. Though to be fair, Tom does have a replacement Infector with Inkmoth Nexus.
And that's exactly the point. Maybe Tom's willing to just let this go at this point. The graveyards are going to be pretty filled up, so Become Immense is going to be active very quickly here.
Yeah, well, he can't Spell Pierce here. Phan actually can pay for it, so
yeah,
he kind of has to let this counter war go. He lost that counter battle, but he may have won the war at the end here.
The alternative play the alternative line he can try to take at least is by crop rotating for Pendelhaven, but because the removal spell is Lightning Bolt, that doesn't even save his creature. So at this point, I think Tom is best served just letting all of this go, crop rotating for a Nexus and going from there.
Factory's going to swing. Looks like Tom goes down to 14. And Phan will pass the turn. So now here comes a crop rotation. He's going to rotate away the Wasteland. He wants his colored mana.
Now, I believe he's aware of a Wasteland from an earlier Gitaxian probe, but he has a second crop rotation. So he can hit this turn. If Phan goes for a Wasteland, he can crop rotate into another Nexus.
Right. He does have two. There is a Wasteland is the remaining card in Phan's hand. So he just gets 2 free Infect damage right now.
Yep. And then next turn is, assuming this line of play happens with no disruption, it's 4 and then Become Immense. Or he
can just draw another copy of Invigorate.
Or he can just kill him.
Become Immense, pitching, delving away the graveyard. This would have been for 8. We might have seen him do this anyway, but the Invigorate that's going to accompany it here is going to be lethal.
So that's the other way to do it, is just kill him.
And 3 copies of Invigorate. So difficult to play around. In fact, like you said, Infect is great at these counter wars because their spells just don't cost mana.
You can see Tom did nothing, while Lamb had a handful of 1 and 2 mana ways of interacting. And then, when Tom was ready to go, pick the fight, Lamb was barely able to hold on, and Tom adding another highlight to the Become Immense reel, which is quickly growing.
It's a one-of in his list, and those one-ofs, the 2 Delve cards, can't be understated. Tom took game 2 off a Treasure Cruise, got game 3 off of the one-of Become Immense. The Delve card's really carrying the day for him.
Yep. A nice new addition to this deck, and great to see Tom move on to 12-1. He's not playing on the Pro Tour just now. Not qualified yet, though he's very close. But I get the opportunity to watch Tom every weekend, and I'll tell you, there are not a lot of people on the planet playing better Magic than Tom Ross. And I would love to see him get one of the next 2 and get back on, because it's only a matter of when, it's not a matter of if. And the sooner the better it is for everyone.
So if you watch, there was the heartbreak at Grand Prix Orlando where Tom at 12:01 had 2 shots to make the Pro Tour. He did not convert on either of them. He's going to get 2 more. We'll see if he can get one of those. Maybe get himself onto the Pro Tour, maybe get himself into the tournament's top 8. For Lamb,